on Straight Talk Africa, some major democratic gains in 2017 and some significant setbacks. In Liberia, the ballot has replaced the bullet with the first peaceful democratic transition in 70 years. The Ugandan parliament changed its constitution, removing presidential age limits, paving the way for Yoweri Museveni to become president for life. And from Angola to Zimbabwe, some unexpected leadership changes. That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America studios here in Washington. I am Shaka Ssali.
Hello, Shaka, and hello to all our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. I'm Ayan Bior, your social media reporter.
Today, it's a discussion on the democracy trajectory and the need for social economic justice for the African people.
And coming up later, our audience has weighed in on our topic through emails, Facebook, and Twitter comments, and we'll reveal some of them ahead on Straight Talk Africa.
What a year 2017 was in the dynamics of African politics. Some unexpected major leadership changes and challenges rippled across the mother continent. My colleague, Paul Cisco, has more.
Liberia achieved its first democratic transition of power in more than 70 years in 2017. George Weah, a former FIFA Player of the Year and senator, was elected president in a runoff ballot against Vice President Joseph Boakai, garnering 65% of the vote. The 51-year-old Weah replaces Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Africa's first female president, who's retiring after 2 terms. There was a stunning turn of events in Zimbabwe, where Emmerson Mnangagwa was elevated from vice president and sworn in as president on November 24th, replacing longtime leader Robert Mugabe, who held power 37 years. Kenya's rocky political ride eased with President Uhuru Kenyatta being sworn in for a second term. Kenyatta defeated opposition candidate Raila Odinga by a slim margin in last year's first presidential poll. But the nation's Supreme Court annulled the ballot, citing vote-counting irregularities by the Electoral Commission as the primary reason. Odinga withdrew from a second presidential vote, urging his supporters to boycott the polls, and he says he's establishing an alternative government. More than 70 people were killed during election-related violence. In January of 2017, Nana Akufo-Addo was inaugurated as Ghana's new president. He defeated incumbent John Mahama in a peaceful vote held in December 2016. Among Africa's biggest surprises, Gambian President Adama Barrow won a December 2016 vote by a slim margin, defeating longtime President Yahya Jammeh. Jammeh initially graciously conceded, only to quickly change his mind. But the Gambian voters didn't change their minds, and Barrow was inaugurated president of Gambia January 19, 2017. Angola's new president is former Defense Minister João Lourenço, rising from the ruling party of José dos Santos. Dos Santos, who held power for 38 years, has been accused of leading one of the most corrupt regimes in Africa. Rwanda's Paul Kagame, a powerful force since the end of the 1994 genocide, claimed 98% of the presidential vote in August, often harassed opposition Green Party candidate Frank Habineza, and independent Philip Mapena only received 2% of the votes cast. Kagame has told his supporters he could remain in power until 2034 if he chooses to, based on constitutional changes lifting term limits passed by referendum in 2015. Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni still holds power. The presidential age limit of 75 was lifted last week. The constitutional amendment was passed by ruling party MPs and signed behind closed doors by Museveni on December 27th. Finally, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, President Joseph Kabila is likely to remain in power for the foreseeable future. The United Nations has called on Kabila to abide by a December 2016 agreement to step down after elections that were once promised for 2017. In November, the nation's Electoral Commission announced a new presidential election has been rescheduled for December 2018. Meanwhile, dozens of people have died in a wave of street protests against Kabila and his government over the election issue. Paul Sisko, VOA News, Washington.
For the latest political developments in Liberia, we are joined by my colleague James Butty, managing editor of VOA's DayBreak Africa radio program, who recently covered the presidential runoff from the capital, Monrovia. Good afternoon, James.
Thank you very much, Shaka, and thank you once again for inviting me to be on your show.
It's a pleasure to have you back, of course, on Straight Talk Africa, especially when you just got back from Liberia. What was it like, really?
I think I can still hear the jubilation throughout the city and throughout Africa. As your piece just said, that democracy continued to be strengthened in Liberia. And I think it was former President Barack Obama who said that democracy is a messy situation, but however messy it is, I think it is strengthening in Liberia because of the peaceful transition that we are about to witness in Liberia with the election of soccer star George Weah.
What was the mood like when you interacted to your fellow countrymen, countrywomen?
Well, I think the people are very happy that George Weah won. Of course, in a contest, someone has to lose. The vice president of the ruling Unity Party lost. But the young people of Liberia particularly are happy because I think the people say they were voting for change. And they look up to George Weah as the embodiment of that change. So now it's up to George Weah to deliver on the promises, the hopes, and the aspirations of the young people of Liberia. I mean, before I left Liberia on the 31st or so, I traveled throughout the new year. People were rejoicing. They said they are holding a 21 days of celebration. That shows how this election is very, very important to the people, particularly the young people of Liberia.
Any particular reason why this particular runoff was not close at all? It was a huge landslide. You're talking about 15 counties, and you're talking about George Weah actually winning 14 out of those 15. Is that correct?
That's right. There are 15 political subdivisions in Liberia. George Weah won 14 of them. The only county that the outgoing vice president won was his Lofa County. Many things we can say that are responsible for that. As I said again, the young people see Weah as their hope and aspiration, the embodiment of their hope and aspiration. But also there was this implosion of the ruling Unity Party. That itself, you had almost a three-way division within the Unity Party. With that kind of division, there's no way the vice president could have won. There are many things that we can attribute to that, but this is the only thing I think was responsible, the implosion in the ruling Unity Party.
How does it feel like for someone like George Weah growing up from very, very humble beginnings? We're talking about slums, really. And at the end of the day, making it, in fact, essentially to State House, to the Executive Mansion in Monrovia.
I saw a piece about his soccer, when he played soccer in Europe, and I saw a very good piece they did of him. And it went back to his days as a young man growing up in Monrovia, a very poor neighborhood. And this is why many of the young people identify with him, because they feel he's part of them. He's part of them. He speaks the way they speak. And so, but they are looking up to him now to deliver at least something that is tangible that they can call a change. They voted for change, and they would like to see some semblance of change in him.
The expectations, of course, are overwhelming. How is he going to deliver? Do you think that he has a sort of magic wand? How is he going to do it, really?
I think in his acceptance speech, he made reference to the fact that Liberia's development partners were still needed. While they may have given some assistance to Liberia in the past, that assistance is still needed just for the time being until Liberia gets on its feet. He has also gone to appeal to, just 2 days ago, he met with the vice president, Joseph Boakai, to say that we may have had a contest, a democratic contest, is over. I still look up to you as the senior person of this country. I would need you to help me deliver on my promises. And also, he's working hand-in-hand with outgoing President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. What many people are complaining about so far is that they think that George Weah must have his own imprint on his own government, that it cannot be 50-50. The outgoing government cannot appoint 50 members of the government and George Weah appoint. George Weah must have his print on the government if he is to deliver what the people want.
What kind of person is George Weah?
I met with George Weah. I think he's very personable. I met with him at his house when I did an interview with him on the day of the election. Very personable person. And he goes on. You have to know, if you are around George Weah, you will notice that just in a moment's time, he will start giving you some analogy that has to do with soccer. At one point, I'm talking to him, and he's talking to other people saying, comparing Messi and Ronaldo in terms of the positions they play. Very personable person. I think I was just laughing when he was talking, and I just joked with him to say, listen, maybe when I come back to Liberia next time, I will meet you on the soccer field to show you how well I can defend against you as a number 9.
You know, I met him one day here at the Voice of America with Sonny Young himself, and frankly, I couldn't understand how this man could be very, very simple. He's just simply nothing but humility. Where did he get that from for a kid that grew up in the slums and suddenly is on top of the world soccer, you know? Probably, I mean, let's face it, probably one of the most famous individuals ever to touch the ball from the African continent.
I think he said, George Weah himself said that during his days as a soccer player, he did something good for the people, but he felt it was not enough. It wasn't enough. And so he returned, worked his way. The first 2 times in 2005, he did not win. 2011, somebody represented his party. He worked away in the Senate. And so he is saying now, listen, if I'm going to deliver for my people, then I have to go on a higher level. And one of the things he told me, he said, James, how do you think I've managed to keep all these young people together? Because he said if things could have gone wrong, but he was able to keep them to the young people who support him during the confusion of the first round when all these legal challenges were happening. He said, I was able to hold down these young people not to cause any problem because we are almost to the promised land. And he said they listened to him. Well, they will continue to listen to George Weah. It's just that he has to now do something tangible that they can see as, that they can point to as improvement.
You know, in his victory speech, he talked about how he intends to create jobs. And he talked about, he also intends to fight against, of course, corruption. And yet, when you look at Liberia, your country largely depends on foreign aid. How is he going to go about that? Was he simply being a politician, talking the talk without necessarily being in a position to walk that particular talk?
That's one of the criticisms that people are now, I mean, as early as it is now, George Weah has not been sworn in. The inauguration is January 22nd this month. But people are saying that this country has a problem with corruption. George Weah himself said that he will welcome anybody who has meaningful suggestions, but he will not tolerate people who want to cheat the people. But if you're bringing back the same people in a government who people say were responsible for corrupt practices, then you will face criticism immediately. So already people are saying, you have to be careful, George Weah. Watch the people you are bringing around yourself in your government, because these people were responsible for stealing from the people, from the Liberian people.
Talk to me, James, and I hope this is the last question. When you look at the African continent, it looks like essentially, really, the trajectory of democracy seems to be working in favor of West Africa. We're talking about ECOWAS really countries. You seem to be, in fact, holding credible elections as compared to Central Africa or East Africa for that matter, and of course, North Africa itself. What is the secret behind that, really?
I think, you know, I was in Monrovia and I saw the ECOWAS delegation led by the former president of Ghana, Mahama, and also the African Union led by the former deputy chair, Mwencha. What I see in West Africa is the regional body able to put its foot down. Things could have gone astray in Liberia because of all the problems that were happening. But ECOWAS came in, Mohamed Ibn Chambers, the ECOWAS delegation came in and told the Liberian government or the Liberian people that you have to let the democratic process work, and we are going to make sure that it works. It is the regional body that must be together. It must have a unified position when you are dealing with problems like democracy. In East Africa, in Central Africa, this has to happen. The regional body must be strong. For example, in West Africa, they say, we are not going to tolerate this if you overthrow a government. That is the position of the African Union, but it has to be enforced. It has to be enforced. It has to be said that the term limit is a problem. You know, Jomo Shaka in Africa, term limit in your country recently, they changed, the president changed it, they changed the term limit. Now, 37 years or so, he is going to continue. If the people of Liberia were tired and wanted change after 12 years of the first female president, what about 37 years in Africa? 37 years for one country, for one leader. That is a lot. So people have to stand up and say, look, the limit, if you serve your country for 2 terms, let it be. This is why people are happy about Liberia today, because President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf served 2 terms. She's going out. Now we have a peaceful transition of government led by George Weah. That is something to look up to for other African countries. They can emulate that.
You have, of course, a peaceful democratic transition for the first time, remember, in 70 years. Correct?
That's right, in 44 or so years. In Liberia, first time a peaceful transition that we are moving from one elected president to another. Probably think about 44 years or so.
I see. Well, James, thank you so much. And of course, congratulations, you and all the people of Liberia.
Thank you very much, Shaka.
You're most welcome. Before pausing for a short break, we want to remind you that Straight Talk Africa is now streaming live on Facebook. To watch our show, just enter the keyword Straight Talk Africa and don't forget to share it with your friends. We are on Twitter, follow us at VOA Shaka, that's VOA Shaka, and join in on today's discussion with your questions and comments. Don't forget to use the hashtag VOA US Africa, and we'll air some of your comments later in the show. We'll be right back with you, so please don't go away.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that inspiration to come to work.
Today's youth are not just the next generation of African leaders, they are today's leaders. And this is the time to invest in them. Today, not tomorrow. So let's connect. Let's engage with each other on issues that will transform our societies. Innovation, leadership, entrepreneurship, things that you're doing to move the continent forward, to make you the greatest generation that Africa has known. It's Upfront every Wednesday, 17:30 UTC, right here on The Voice of America.
And we thank, of course, Paul for the earlier report. Joining us here in the VOA studio are 2 distinguished guests. Dr. Hashim El-Tinay, founder and president of International Peace Quest Institute, and Muwanga Batuuka, official spokesperson, Uganda Democratic Federation. Gentlemen, I have to say that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you for the first time on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you, Shaka. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you, and it's wonderful to start the new year with this fantastic program because, you know, we live here, but we come from Africa. And I always say that I'm a thinker, which means that I'm not a politician. Mm-hmm. And I try to serve through ideas, sharing ideas. And I think the main idea which makes this opportunity incredible is the fact that your audience is not only Africa, it is the world. But I come from a place where I believe that, and I think everybody in the audience believes that.
And where do you come from?
I come originally from Sudan, the Nile Valley. So my heritage and my understanding is that we are all Africans. Humanity is African. So I'm speaking to humanity. And our problems, there are particularities here and there, but in essence, the problems are really of the human species.
And we'll discuss, of course, some of those
Right.
particular human problems later in the program. What about you, Mr. Muwanga?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be hosted by Shaka. My first time, of course, but I'm exceedingly grateful for the invitation. I'm looking forward for the discussion tonight.
Have you been following the program?
Yes, I have.
I see.
Yes.
Now, listening to James Butty talking about the people of Liberia celebrating really for a very credible election that ushers in a very, very legitimate President George Weah, and of course, hoping to receive the baton from incumbent President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf after she successfully completes her 2 terms.
That's right.
You come from Uganda.
That's right.
How do you see this? You have some individual in Uganda who basically says that, you know what, he still needs some time to accomplish his agenda.
Yeah.
How do you react to that?
The reaction can be analyzed from very many different ways, Shaka. First of all, we can look at the individual. We can look at the system that he's creating. And of course, we can look at the plight of our people. Because what has happened, and if I could start from a general point, of course, I congratulate our colleagues from Liberia. But what we've seen in Africa so far is a democracy that is minimalist at the very least. And it does not come with the twin of good governance, meaning the state capacity to create predictable, accountable, transparent frameworks for the conduct of public business. One. Number two, I believe that the wave, which is sometimes scholars, thinkers like my colleague here refer to as the third wave, which swept part of Africa, into the 90s, we are looking at leaders that adopted democracy to seduce international donors rather than on the basis of their belief in the intrinsic value of democracy, the rule of law, freedom, and liberty. Third, most of Africa, for all the joy sometimes that there is some good news in what we shared, especially in the opening of the program, probably 61% of the population in Africa is said to be living in either a free or a partly free democratic, country one way or the other.
You think that it is up to that huge percentage, really?
Actually not, because that's why I qualified it. It is said to be free to partly free, you know. But what has happened, if we look at that democracy, and I think, you know, Africa needs to look at the concept of democracy, because what I see, especially in Uganda now, when you narrow it down to Uganda, is majoritarian, whereby democracy is being used to overthrow democracy. You have mob rule, as the Greeks one time
You
back
mean
there.
using the law to undermine democracy?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Rule by law.
Absolutely.
Not rule of law.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
But someone might ask you, Muwanga, he might say, wait a minute. When you look at Uganda, you're talking about nearly 40 million human beings. How can an individual from Rwachitura, Yoweri Museveni,
Yeah.
you know, dominate the entire country? What about somebody who said once that no society gets a leadership that it desires, that you actually get who you deserve?
There is truth in that assertion, unfortunately, because what happened, I think I can cite maybe two factors here. We had a defect at birth from, you know, when we gained our independence. Why am I saying that? We had a monolithic system that was repressive and that was non-competitive. But then we received the instruments of power to navigate and negotiate the potentially adversarial democratic dispensation with the tools that were monolithic. So that was difficult for our post-independence leaders to grapple with. And then what happened, you ended up with the single-party system, centralization of power, personalization of power, and of course the corruption. Now, when you look at Uganda today, sadly, now to your point that, you know, put it differently, that you get the government you deserve, is the population, you have, sadly, a moral and social dislocation whereby the petition from the individuals to their government is no longer for the public good, but for their personal needs. In other words, you have a population that is shaking leadership for cash, and leadership is giving it to them, and in return, they are gaining and retaining power. And another point to raise here with especially the person of Yoweri Museveni, he's a person, in my view, who still resides in the medieval era. By that I mean, he still believes that there is no equality in terms of, you know, people, that there is a single individual who is endowed with that wisdom and the vision, and he should be the person who inherently has the right to rule over others. And for someone who, you know, shrugs on aristocracy, you'd think that he would not perpetuate this position whereby he actually believes that power, wisdom is flowing from the top to the bottom instead of being the source from the masses, empowering and making those decisions.
I see. Well, time happens not to be our best ally, Muwanga. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment, including our social media segment. So please, don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
The lyrics could be French,
English,
Portuguese,
Bantu,
Arabic.
it is the beat.
The African beat that counts.
The beat does all the translations.
It cuts across all languages and gives us the understanding that this is the African beat.
It is so distinct
and adhesive.
It binds us together.
African beat on the Voice of America. For more information, visit our website at www.voanews.com/AfricanBeat.
Welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. It's time to bring in our social media reporter, Ayen Biyor. Take it away, Ayen.
Well, thanks, Shaka. A number of radical and unprecedented political changes took place in Africa in 2017. African politicians are hailing these changes as a sign of democracy advancing. But analysts are often skeptical. Well, this leads us to our question of the week, which asked, do you believe 2017 was a good year for democracy in Africa, and why? Well, you guys had a lot to say, so let's start the conversation with a tweet from Chagolan Shabi, who writes, it was not a good year for democracy. We witnessed the arrest of government critics, the banning of media, stopping political parties. And we have another tweet from Habat Nkula from Kampala in Uganda, who agrees. He says, no, it was not a good year for democracy in Africa. In Uganda, the presidential age limit of 75 was scrapped to allow the 3 decades ruler Yoweri Museveni to continue at the helm. Burundi also changed their constitution to allow President Pierre Nkurunziza to rule until 2034. Well, now to our social media comment of the week from Facebook fan Marvin Kasuja, also in Kampala, Uganda, who writes, not in Africa as a whole, but in some countries, the rule of law was respected. Notable examples are Kenya's Supreme Court nullifying President Uhuru Kenyatta's first election win, the ousting of former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe without any violence and bloodshed, and Liberia's peaceful presidential runoff. Well, let's go to another comment from Facebook fan Mohammed S. Mustafa from Freetown in Sierra Leone, who writes, last year was not a good year for Sierra Leone, where the president sacked the elected vice president. There was widespread corruption, human rights violations, and political suppression, fake promises, fake youth empowerment, poor health facilities, and no justice. We are counting down the time to the March 7th, 2018 election. We need better representation for our future generation. And now our last Facebook comment comes from Stephen Sakor, who lives in Monrovia, Liberia. He's a bit more optimistic. He says, yes, 2017 was a good year for democracy because my country, Liberia, made it through. Our democracy was put to the test, but we overcame. And in 2018, we will see a smooth transition between outgoing President Ellen Johnson and President-elect George Weah. Well, on that positive note, a reminder that we appreciate all the audience feedback. If you're a new fan, drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. To comment on our Facebook page, just enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com. To join our YouTube channel, just sign up to VOA TV2 Africa. Follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook, or simply go to VOA's Straight Talk Africa TV program page on our website. To watch us live on your mobile device, download the VOA mobile app. Now let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program. On the next Straight Talk Africa, she became one of the first black models to achieve an international career. She's been called the Super Eagles lady for the Nigerian football team. For most of her life, she's been an ardent advocate for African and American rights, Ethiopian immigrants and prisoners of war. Meet Yahararwork Gashau. That's on the next Straight Talk Africa. Well, Shaka, as you can see, you and the guest have a lot of social media comments to discuss. Back to you.
Well, Ayen, thank you so much for sharing some social media reaction with us. Today's topic is the democracy trajectory and the need for socio-economic justice for the African people. Our two distinguished guests are Hashim El-Tinay founder and the president of International Peace Quest Institute, and Muwanga Batuuka, official spokesperson, Uganda Democratic Federation. Again, gentlemen, I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you for the first time on Straight Talk Africa.
Pleasure is ours.
Well, you're most welcome. Now,
thank you, Shaka.
You're most welcome, of course.
It's our privilege, really, to be here. So thank you very much for what you are doing. It's a great work, and as you know, as ideas, we can't share them without you.
Very interesting. I have to apologize to you, of course, Muwanga, because I had to interject. Because being in the studio 52 here is like being on a military square, military parade. If the producer says to go, you have to go.
Absolutely.
So I hope that you'll find some space in your beautiful Ugandan heart. Forgive me for that.
Absolutely.
Could you please complete your point? Just a minute, please.
Just a minute. Well, yeah, I was making the case about the person of President Museveni. Of course, I mentioned his medieval view, and of course, the last point I was going to make, I alluded to it earlier, is the destruction of democracy by democracy. What has happened is, the long term is, one, the fusion of the persona of the president, the party, the political party, the government, and the state into one entity, serving one single purpose.
Yeah, but on the contrary, Mr. Batuuka, he tells you that in fact he went to the bush as a revolutionary,
correct,
as a liberator, to fight for the restoration of democracy, and that in fact he brought to you back democracy. He restored democracy. He says all these things that are happening, they are happening because they are being done by constitutions through the rule of law. In fact, when he talks about the recent, for example, petition, which helped obviously to amend the constitution so he could sort of run for presidency indefinitely, he says, you know, those types of people like you are basically liars who talk about life presidency of Museveni, and in fact you should be exposed for what you say, because he says they are either uninformed individuals talking about things they do not know, or evil schemers who do not want Uganda and Africa to succeed.
Yeah, I would believe him if there wasn't a record of the same gentleman telling us that he didn't believe in the piece of paper, the Constitution. He was in Kasese in 2002 when he said that he didn't believe in the Constitution, even though those provisions were there, that it allows people who should not be in government to run against him.
Could it be that he was misquoted?
No, because he has had an opportunity to actually repeat other things that are similar. You know, last year, he actually said that he's not a servant of the people, that was working for himself and for his family. He has been quoted many times, you know, suggesting that he hunted his animal and it was his right of conquest to distribute and share it with whomever he chooses. He has told a population in the last part of his rule, maybe in slumber, that he was the only person who had the vision. Nobody else had any vision at all in the country. So this is a gentleman who believes in his singular ability and talent to rule this country. Anyone else that would criticize him was ill-informed and malcontent.
Well, he obviously seems to be getting his way. Let's come to you, Dr. Hashim. It's not by any means that we can only talk about the person of Yoweri Museveni, who happens to be president of Uganda. What about in your particular case? Field Marshal
Omar al-Bashir, yeah. one of the important things that the Sudanese people remember of al-Bashir is that he said one day that I have taken power by the gun. Whoever wants power has to come and take it by the gun.
Very interesting.
You know, there was a law here in this country that coup d'etats should not be tolerated and shouldn't be given legitimacy.
Correct.
So what I'm saying is that imagine that America has delivered on that and didn't go with the flow.
No, but America has delivered on that. They do not, for example, do business or recognize any general, colonel, or corporal who seizes power with the AK-47 anymore. Nor does even the African Union actually do business with you if you do that. The tragedy is that politicians have become so smart that they no longer have to use the AK-47. All they do is to steal the vote. All they do is to change the constitution, which they are in fact supposed to defend, uphold, and protect. Why is it that the international community, and I'm talking about the United States, the European Union, the African Union, and what have you, why don't they also, just like they cannot allow somebody to seize power with an AK-47, why can't they also come up and say, you know what, if you swear by a constitution, you're going to have to respect it, otherwise we are not going to do business with you.
Yeah, so granted, what I was really trying to share with you and the public is the problem of, you know, integrity in terms of the political culture that is available in the world today. I think there is too much tendency for opportunism in politics, you know, and opportunity rather than on integrity of principle, you know, and so the issue.
So it's about interests.
It's about basically about interests, and there are 3 points that are actually at the root of this approach that are dominant in Sudan, in Africa, in Europe, in the United States. These 3 ills are defined by Martin Luther King as racism, militarism, and greed. They underlie the very foundation of political thought and political action.
What about injustice? He also talked about, you know, injustice anywhere. Is injustice everywhere?
It's a threat to justice everywhere. So that's why I think at this beginning of the year, you know, resolutions and stuff like that, I think we need to hear voices of people who can just humble, you know, the political machine, you know, and the power machines everywhere in Africa and everywhere. That's why earlier I said, you know, I'm speaking to the whole world because, you know, Africa is the birthplace of humanity, and that's where I stand. And so we are all really African, regardless of...
It is the birthplace of humanity. Are you talking about Olduvai Gorge?
Which one?
Olduvai Gorge.
Yeah. Yes, of course. So it's, I mean, it's like the Garden of Eden, you know, of the world. And if we stand on that, you know, all of us as humans stand on that, and try to actually atone to all the sins that we committed against Africa and so on. and rectify the narrative, you know, revisit the narrative, and take the high road in terms of morality and so on. Then we can actually develop a new vision of liberation. A liberation from what we believe today, which needs to be updated somehow.
What do we believe in today?
Well,
it seems to me, frankly, that a lot of these leaders basically happen to be patriotic, according to some sources, to their stomachs. The stomachs of their families, the stomachs of their friends, but not society.
Well, that's precisely what I'm saying. That's what I alluded to when I said this is a politics that is rooted in racism, militarism, which is violence, and greed. People are self-serving, you know, and they are not. And by the way, most of the politicians now in Africa, their ceiling is that they want power and wealth. You never hear them speak about wanting to serve the common good of the people. It's high time that this changes, you know?
You know, when you do your homework, you will find that some of the key founding fathers of Africa, for example, the Ozajefo, Ghana's founding leader, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah.
Right.
If you go to Tanzania and you look at Julius Kambarage Nyerere, you go to Zambia, you look at Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, and you go to Botswana, you look at Seretse Khama, and what have you. These people were very patriotic. They do not have boundaries or borders in their minds. For them, they were Africans. They did not have overseas bank accounts. They did not have overseas houses. But now, you have these leaders who were called in the 90s a new breed of African leaders, the beacons of hope for African democracy. These people have houses in America, they have houses in Europe, they have bank accounts, they have control whatever they preside over and what have you. Some of them are very arrogant enough to say that, in fact, they are not even servants of anybody.
You know, it's, Shaka, I'm very happy you mentioned Nkrumah, because I consider him as my mentor. The first political book I ever read in my life when I was 17 was the autobiography of Kwame Nkrumah. And I sat down and wrote him a letter, and the first letter I wrote in English in my life, and the first letter I received was from Nkrumah. And he said to me in the letter, I see promise in you. I advise you to take your studies very seriously in order not to be wanting when you are called upon to play your role in the reconstruction of Mother Africa. I never turned back.
He actually responded to your letter.
Yes, and he said, I was very happy and touched by your letter because it revealed to me the extent to which the African youth are becoming more and more aware of African issues.
Very interesting.
You see, so I never turned back. That's why I'm here today.
But now, Muwanga,
yes,
we're talking about the need, frankly, for socio-economic justice for all of us.
correct.
How do we bring that about?
I think first and foremost, there has to be a campaign using all channels, including, frankly, the show that you're hosting. Because some of us who have had the privilege, largely on taxpayers' expense of education, exposure, and stuff like that, we've acquainted ourselves with some ideas, with some other practices in different parts of the world. And indeed, some of the points I was developing earlier, like democracy, and we throw around this thing about democracy, but I dare you that, a lot of our people really understand the texture, the dynamics of democracy we are talking about. A lot of them perceive it as the next round of voting, and that's it. When you go back to ancient Greece, ancient Greece gave us democracy and philosophy, but we only took democracy and we only took it as a majoritarian device. That's it. The philosophy that could have helped us with deliberations, depth of thought into what form of government that we need to have, what should be the political authority, to what extent does that authority go into our lives, then what are those norms? What are those structures that will safeguard our liberty, that our rights precede their antecedent to the government? So the purpose of that government ought to be primarily to protect them. Now, then the systems that will help us handle the political and social intercourse, because there is going to be tensions, adversarial intercourse and stuff like that. But there has to be an effort on some of us who know this stuff to help enlighten our relatives and so forth, because constitutionalism and the Constitution and all these things are not that piece of paper, but the normative behavior of a population that will recognize their right, that will recognize their obligation, and that will demand and petition government to do what it needs to do. And my last point that I'm going to make, especially about Uganda, and of course I heard about how the African Union is talking about how we cannot have coups and stuff like that. The question becomes, especially for Uganda, there is a rationale that already Museveni put, as a president. Based on rigged voting, he went to the bush, one. Secondly, if you believe in natural justice, the question becomes...
So he got the right to rig elections himself?
Yeah, he did. If you believe in natural justice, and you believe that fundamental law on, natural law provides you the right to protect yourself, and that right that we collectively, grant to government to protect us has been now turned against us offensively. Do we sit back and take it? At what point do we call back that right which we believe in the Uganda Democratic Federation, that right is reversionary? We can reclaim it. We can do that, and then the new dispensation ought to have a normative content. It ought to have the structures that are going to protect us, and we have to have the systems that are widely known by everyone to be guarded jealously. That's how we keep the peace and prosperity.
But in fairness to Yoweri Museveni and some of his colleagues, you have a situation where they hold what they call periodic elections.
Yeah.
And they have an electoral commission to boot. And this electoral commission actually announces results.
Yeah.
If you look at those results carefully, they may in the end not necessarily be reflecting the will of the voter,
absolutely,
the people, but perhaps the will of the people who count the vote or who announce the results.
That's true.
But what about the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court is not made up of Museveni and his colleagues. Why do they, in fact, go ahead and endorse such a sham?
It's a very good question. When you look at this misrule that we've had over 30 years, you see a gradual degeneration of the quality of the justices that we have. I would name one, Stephen Kavuma. Even among his peers and his colleagues, he's denounced.
He was the Deputy Chief Justice of Uganda,
exactly,
correct?
by some of the decisions that he's making. So there is a gradual degeneration. Part of it is, of course, due to corruption. Another part of it, a factor that we should not forget, is the intimidation. You recall twice when that temple of justice was surrounded by the Black Mamba.
Yeah.
You recall how the injunctions and other decisions of the court are being thrown aside. At this point, you are getting more and more cadres into the judiciary. And this goes back to the total disintegration of the structures and the institutions which citizens use as venues and channels to cause change. Once you have that destruction, once they become, if you don't have the efficacy of those institutions, then that change is inevitable. And unfortunately, that change may come via violence.
You know, Dr. Eshami, I think listening to Muwanga, he raises the issue of the need for men and women of character and integrity. That in fact, those types of people are missing in action. Where is Nelson Mandela when we need him? Where is Walter Sisulu? Where are these types of people?
Yeah, so which takes us to the issue of the vision. You know, we can talk all we want about processes, you know, because that's how things are done, you know, in reality. But I think there is too much emphasis on process and less attention to the bigger picture, you know. I always share with my audiences and friends the challenges that we have, and that's why I started by saying that we are all African. We are all, because Africa is the birthplace of humanity, the birthplace of spirituality, and the birthplace of civilization. We are all African. We are all in this together. And the reality of the world today is that we are one human species, and the challenges that are facing us, all of us. There are, of course, differences of degree. So I'm glad you mentioned Greece and, you know, the different contributions of different cultures and different civilizations in terms of the narrative of humanity.
You have a minute.
Sure. So the important thing, really, that I would like to leave with the audience and the people is that it's high time that we get serious about deeper awareness of who we are, a better consciousness of the meaning of who we are and how we can, and the power that is within us, and then to awaken our spirits and to take the high ground and to dream big and to think big.
The moral high ground, you mean?
Moral high ground, and then to, you know, just to have a vision that is inspiring, that takes us up to the mountaintop instead of staying down in the valleys of death.
Very interesting. So we have to be pretty much looking at the forest rather than the trees which are going to fall.
Absolutely.
The big picture.
Yeah, and then the example of Liberia, and congratulations, George Weah, and the Liberian people. The example is that when people, because people are with him, so when people get it, they are powerful and they can change the world.
I hate to say it on that note. Thanks to our guests, Dr. Hashim El-Tinay and Muwanga Batuuka. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning is DayBreak Africa with James Butty. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter Africa. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.